I was standing in my future father-in-law's dining room when he slid a contract across the table and demanded I transfer the entire $80,000 down payment I had saved for our first home into his personal account. He claimed it was a family tradition, proving loyalty before marriage. When I refused, he threatened to call off my wedding to his son, Julian. My stomach dropped as everyone stared at me. I realized this wasn't a request, it was extortion. The room felt cold despite the fancy chandeliers above. Julian's father, Preston, sat there with a smug look on his face, waiting for me to break. My hands trembled as I gripped my purse. I looked around the room, hoping for a sign of support, but the silence was heavy. I realized then that my life was being treated like a business deal by a man who valued control over people. As I left the house in tears, his final words followed me, "You'll never marry my son without my blessing." The door clicked shut behind me, feeling like the final seal on a dark, hidden trap. I walked to my car, my mind racing. I was not just fighting for my money, I was fighting for my dignity. I expected Julian to defend me. Instead, he asked me to keep the peace and consider sending the money. The betrayal hurt more than his father's demand. That night, Julian revealed his father, Preston Whitmore, controlled a family investment fund worth millions. If Preston disapproved of our marriage, Julian could lose everything. Suddenly I wasn't just fighting for my savings, I was fighting for my future relationship. I looked at Julian, seeing a stranger instead of the man I loved. He spoke about his father's power like a prisoner describing a jailer. He didn't see the extortion, he only saw the danger of losing his inheritance. My heart sank deeper into my chest. Was I a partner to him, or just another asset to be moved around his father's board? The apartment felt small and stifling. I realized that Julian had lived under his father's thumb for so long that he had forgotten how to stand up for himself. He kept repeating, "It's only money, Madison." I wanted to scream. It wasn't about the cash. It was about respect and the foundation of our life together. The rift between us grew wider by the second as he insisted I just obey. Over the next week, Julian's relatives began calling me. Every conversation carried the same message: Preston always gets what he wants. His sister implied I was selfish for holding on to my own hard-earned money. His aunt suggested I wasn't family material, because I didn't trust the family tradition. I started wondering how many women before me had been bullied into submission by this group of people. The phone calls were relentless. They chipped away at my confidence, making me feel like an outsider who didn't understand the rules. Then a cousin accidentally let slip that another fiancé once disappeared from the family entirely. My blood ran cold. Disappeared? I pressed for more details, but the line went dead. I sat in my living room, surrounded by wedding catalogs that suddenly looked like grave markers. They were a pack of wolves, and I was the one they had chosen to hunt. I realized they didn't care about the wedding, they cared about keeping their power structure intact. Every voice on the other end of the line was a puppet speaking with Preston's vocal cords. I felt more alone than ever, knowing I was the only one who saw the strings. Curiosity got the better of me. I tracked down Julian's ex-fiancée, Savannah Brooks. What she told me chilled me to the bone. Preston had demanded money from her too. When she refused, he orchestrated a campaign that destroyed the engagement. She explained how he planted rumors, isolated her from Julian, and even threatened her career. She spoke with a voice that sounded tired, like someone who had survived a long war. Before hanging up, Savannah warned me, "The money isn't what he's really after. It's about breaking you so you never think you're equal to them." I sat in my car, staring at my phone as the screen went dark. Everything she said aligned with the pressure I felt from the rest of the family. It wasn't about tradition, it was about humiliation. Preston needed his victims to know their place at the bottom of the ladder. I felt a surge of anger replace my fear. Savannah had managed to escape, and she was doing better than ever. Her story was a map, and I was determined to follow it to find the exit. I wasn't going to let Preston win. While reviewing wedding expenses, I noticed Julian making unexplained monthly payments to an unknown account. The amounts were substantial. When I asked about them, he became defensive. He claimed it was a private family matter that I shouldn't worry about. For the first time, I wondered if Preston's influence ran deeper than I knew. My suspicion grew into a gnawing knot in my stomach. Why would a man who supposedly had millions need secret, large monthly transfers? I started keeping a log of the dates and times. They always happened right after a phone call from his father. It looked less like an investment and more like a ransom. I decided to keep my eyes open and my mouth shut. If Julian wasn't going to be honest with me, I would have to find the truth on my own. I started digging into the bank statements that were left lying around. Every time I got close to an answer, Julian would move his laptop or change the subject. The secrecy was becoming a wall between us. It felt like I was living with someone who was hiding a secret life, and I was terrified to find out what it was. At a restaurant downtown, I spotted Preston having dinner with a woman who definitely wasn't his wife, Denise. They weren't acting like coworkers. The woman leaned in close, laughing at something Preston said, and placed a hand on his arm. They were sharing a bottle of expensive wine, looking very comfortable. The woman hugged him intimately before leaving. When Preston turned to check the door, his eyes locked onto mine. His face went pale. He froze, his glass halfway to his mouth. I didn't look away. I watched him scramble to look normal, but the panic was etched into his features. He knew I had seen them. I stood up and walked out of the restaurant before he could say a word. My mind was spinning. Who was she? Why was the great, arrogant Preston Whitmore so afraid of me seeing him with someone else? The pieces were starting to shift into a pattern I didn't quite understand yet, but it was clear that Preston had a secret. He was acting like a man who had everything to lose, and my discovery had just put a target on his back. The next morning, Preston appeared at my apartment uninvited. He didn't knock, he just let himself in with a key he clearly wasn't supposed to have. He warned me to stop sticking my nose where it doesn't belong. His voice was low and dangerous, stripped of its usual grandfatherly act. Then he repeated his demand for the down payment, but this time, there was a desperate edge to his tone. His sudden panic over a simple dinner raised more questions than answers. He didn't care about my money for tradition anymore, he cared about silencing me. I stood my ground, my heart thumping against my ribs. What are you hiding, Preston? I asked. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. He told me that my life would become very difficult if I kept poking around. He left as quickly as he came, leaving behind the heavy scent of his expensive cologne. I realized that dinner was the key. He wasn't just worried about his reputation, he was protecting something that could ruin him. I needed to know exactly what that dinner represented. The game had officially turned dangerous, but I was done running away. A bank notification accidentally popped up on Julian's laptop while we were planning wedding details. The account name matched the one receiving his monthly transfers. When I investigated further, I discovered the payments weren't going to an investment fund. They were supporting someone. I didn't mean to spy, but the information was right there in front of me. I quickly wrote down the account details, my fingers flying across a notepad. The name on the account wasn't an investment firm. It was a person's name, a woman's name. I felt like the world was spinning. Julian was sending money to a woman, and his father was the one orchestrating it. This wasn't about a secret business venture, it was about a secret life. Every time I looked at Julian now, I saw the lies. He had been lying to me since the moment we met. The wedding planning felt like a cruel joke. I realized that my intuition was right all along. The family was built on a foundation of deception, and I was the fool who had almost been pulled into the basement. I needed to see who this woman was. I followed a lead to a suburban neighborhood, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. There I saw the same mystery woman from the restaurant helping a teenage boy carry groceries into a small house. Moments later, a luxury car pulled into the driveway. Preston arrived. He stepped out, hugged the boy like a father, and laughed at something the teenager said. My heart nearly stopped. It wasn't an affair. It was something much bigger. He wasn't just cheating, he was living a double life. The domestic scene in front of me, the groceries, the suburban lawn, the casual interaction, was the definition of a family. He was playing the part of a dedicated father to this boy in a way I had never even seen him act with Julian. I pulled my car into a nearby side street, overwhelmed. My brain struggled to process the image of Preston as a doting dad. It was a complete contradiction to the man I knew. He was a master of manipulation, and he had been playing us all for fools for years. I had to know what was going on in that house. Property records revealed Preston secretly owned the home. It wasn't rented, it was fully paid off. Yet no one in Julian's family knew it existed. The pieces weren't fitting together. I spent hours at the public records office, digging through stacks of digital files. The house was registered under a shell company that looped back to Preston's personal accounts. Why keep it hidden? Why force his own son to pay for it? It wasn't just a secret family, it was a financial drain. He was using Julian's money to keep this shadow life running. I felt sick thinking about the money Julian had invested. It wasn't an investment, it was maintenance for a lie. Every dollar I had been asked to hand over was likely going to be poured into this house, too. I looked at the maps, the names, and the dates, and a cold clarity washed over me. This was the source of his power. He needed control to maintain the facade. He needed the money to feed the secret. He was a man drowning in his own greed, and he was trying to drag me down with him. Confronted with evidence, Julian finally broke. He admitted he had known about the house for years. Preston forced him to send money every month and swear secrecy, threatening to cut him off if he ever told his mother or me. Julian refused to explain why, just sitting there with his head in his hands, shaking. His guilt told me everything wasn't as simple as an affair. It felt like he was trapped in a cycle of abuse that went back to his childhood. I watched him cry, but for once, I felt no desire to comfort him. He had lied to my face for months, letting me believe he was a victim of his father's tradition. He was just as responsible for the deceit. The house of cards was falling, and he was right there in the middle of it. I realized then that I couldn't marry him. I couldn't build a life with someone who would participate in such a massive betrayal. The trust was gone, incinerated by his silence. He kept trying to apologize, but his words meant nothing. The truth was far heavier than any wedding band could ever be. A public records search uncovered a birth certificate. The teenage boy's father was listed as Preston Whitmore. I stared at the document in disbelief, the words blurring before my eyes. Preston had another son. 17 years. That's how long he had been hiding this child. The math added up. This boy was born while Preston was already married to Denise and while Julian was a young child. It was a double life that had been running for nearly 2 decades. My mind raced through all the times I had seen Preston act like a pillar of the community, a man of morals. It was all a performance. The document was a smoking gun, a final piece of evidence that proved everything I suspected. I wondered if the boy knew about Julian. I wondered if he knew his father was a man who extorted his own family to keep his secrets alive. This wasn't just a scandal, it was a tragedy. Preston hadn't just betrayed his wife, he had forced his son to be a silent partner in his sin. The sheer scale of the dishonesty was enough to make my head spin. I learned the truth. For 17 years, Preston had maintained a secret second family in another state. He financially supported them while pretending to be a devoted husband and father at home. He had lived 2 lives, splitting his time and his resources between them. The woman I saw was his second wife in everything but the law. This explained his obsession with control and money. He was essentially funding 2 households, 2 lives, and 2 legacies. It was a massive financial juggling act that had clearly started to fail. That was why he came for my down payment. He was desperate. He had tapped out his own accounts and was now squeezing his legitimate family dry to keep the illusion of his second life afloat. I realized that my $80,000 wasn't just money to him, it was oxygen for his sinking ship. He had no intention of letting me into the family because I was a witness who could potentially uncover the truth. I was an obstacle, and he had tried to bribe me into silence before moving to destroy me. Then another bombshell dropped. Preston's finances weren't nearly as strong as everyone believed. Supporting 2 families had drained him. His demand for my down payment wasn't tradition, he desperately needed cash. A financial report I found in his discarded office files showed that the Whitmore name was mostly built on debt. He was robbing Peter to pay Paul. The investment fund that Julian feared losing was actually empty. It was all a grand act to keep his status. If word got out that the great Preston Whitmore was broke, he would lose everything, his status, his second family, and his power over his first. This explained why he was so aggressive. He was cornered like a rat. He didn't have millions, he had millions in liabilities. My down payment was meant to plug a hole in his accounts. He was a fraud, and he was terrified that the world would finally see it. I stood in my apartment, clutching the files, and felt a wave of relief. I had the power now. I wasn't just the victim, I was the one holding the keys to his undoing. A forensic accountant friend helped me investigate further. We discovered Preston's family investment fund was mostly smoke and mirrors. Much of the money had vanished over the years through bad investments and the high cost of maintaining 2 separate lives. It was all a shell game, a way to make sure the family never looked too closely at the books. Preston had been shifting money around for years, moving funds to cover his tracks and pay off his second family's expenses. It was textbook embezzlement on a personal level. My friend looked at the data and shook his head, saying that this wasn't just bad luck, it was criminal. Preston had been cheating everyone, his wife, his children, and even his investors. He was a hollow man standing in a palace made of glass. The evidence was overwhelming. He hadn't just failed as a father, he had failed as a steward of his own fortune. The family tradition of loyalty was just a cover-up for his own bankruptcy. Everything he built was about to come crashing down. Someone anonymously mailed documents to Denise, Preston's wife. Suddenly, Preston's wife began asking difficult questions. I had sent her the proof of the second family and the financial drain. She was a strong woman, and seeing the truth broke the spell she had been under for decades. Tension exploded inside the Whitmore family. I heard reports of screaming matches that could be heard from the street. Denise started calling attorneys and freezing accounts. It was the beginning of the end. Preston tried to gaslight her, to tell her it was all a misunderstanding, but the evidence was too clear. The documents told a story he couldn't talk his way out of. Watching the family fracture from the outside, I felt a sense of justice being served. He had tried to crush me, but in doing so, he had invited the scrutiny that would destroy his life. The secrets he worked so hard to hide were now being shouted from the rooftops. He was losing the only thing he cared about, his image of absolute control. Julian's siblings turned on each other. Some defended Preston, still blinded by their own privilege, while others demanded answers about their missing inheritance. The family that once pressured me now looked like it was tearing itself apart. The dinner table where I was once interrogated was now a war zone. Siblings were fighting over who knew what and when. The dynamics had shifted from protect the father to save myself. It was ugly to witness, but it was the inevitable result of living a lie. Every secret has a price, and the Whitmores were paying it in full. I stayed away, keeping my distance and focusing on my own life. I had no interest in being part of the fallout. I had done what I needed to do. I had saved myself. The family was imploding, and it was a direct consequence of their own greed and lack of integrity. They had chosen to support a liar, and now they were left with the ashes of his empire. I finally felt free of the fear that had kept me awake for weeks. Instead of admitting the truth, Preston doubled down. He publicly accused me of fabricating everything. He held a press conference, or as close to one as he could get, claiming I was trying to destroy the family because I refused his blessing and his tradition. He played the victim, talking about how a disgruntled ex-fiancé was out for revenge. He looked pathetic on camera, his face red and his voice shaking. People in the town started to whisper, but there were still those who believed the wealthy patriarch over me. It was frustrating, but I knew the truth was a slow-acting poison. You can't stop it once it's in the system. His desperate attempts to smear me only made him look more guilty. Every time he opened his mouth to lie, he gave me more time to organize my facts. He was fighting a war he had already lost, but he was too arrogant to see the writing on the wall. I just kept gathering my evidence, waiting for the right moment to release the final nail in his coffin. The lawsuit threat arrived via a fancy law firm letterhead. Preston threatened legal action if I continued spreading lies. For a moment, I feared he might actually win. He had money for top-tier lawyers, and I was just a regular person with a regular job. The letter was designed to scare me, and honestly, it worked. My hands shook as I read the legal jargon. But then I looked at the files I had gathered. He was threatening me with a court appearance, but a courtroom is where evidence is presented under oath. He was actually giving me the perfect platform to show the world exactly what he had done. If he wanted a fight, he would get one. I hired an attorney who specialized in exposing fraud. When she looked at my evidence, she grinned. "He's not going to sue you," she told me. "He's going to run the moment he realizes we're ready to share this with the judge." The fear turned into resolve. I was going to beat him at his own game. The financial records revealed decades of payments to the second family. We filed the evidence in court, and the paper trail was undeniable. It wasn't just a few payments, it was a constant, years-long stream of money that left no room for doubt. Preston's entire story collapsed overnight. The bank statements, the property deeds, and the birth certificate were all linked together in a clear, damning narrative. The press, which had been skeptical at first, turned on him instantly. Reporters were camped out in front of his home, asking questions about the boy, the house, and the investment fund. His lies were exposed in headlines across the state. He couldn't hide behind his lawyers anymore. The judge ordered a full audit, and it was clear that Preston had not only been dishonest to his family but had also committed serious financial crimes. The truth was out, and it was loud, ugly, and impossible to ignore. Preston went from being the town's most respected citizen to its most notorious fraud in a single news cycle. As the scandal exploded, I realized my biggest problem wasn't Preston anymore, it was Julian. He had known pieces of the truth all along. I had to decide whether I could still marry him. He kept pleading with me, saying he was scared and that he would change. But the damage to our relationship remained uncertain. How could I trust him with our life when he had spent years helping his father lie to me? I took a long, quiet vacation to think about everything. I realized that a marriage is built on trust, and my trust in him was non-existent. He had prioritized his father's secrets over our honesty. Even if he was a victim of his father's manipulation, he had the choice to be honest with me, and he chose to keep lying. I couldn't be with someone who was still tethered to that toxic world. It wasn't about being angry anymore, it was about being realistic. I deserved a life that didn't have to be built on secrets or fear. For the first time in his life, Julian is against his father publicly. He admitted what he knew and apologized for failing to protect me. He went to the authorities and gave them every bit of information he had about the secret family and the fraudulent accounts. It was a brave act, but it came late. He acknowledged that his silence had made him a part of the problem. But the damage to our relationship remained. He was finally breaking free, but the person who needed to break free was me. I appreciated his growth, but it didn't change the fact that I had been treated like an outsider to be managed rather than a partner to be cherished. He told me he loved me, and I believed him, but love isn't enough when the foundation is rotten. Watching him finally stand up for himself was good for him, but I realized that my own path didn't lead back to him. I was ready to walk alone. 1 week before the ceremony, I called off the wedding. Not out of revenge, but because trust had to be rebuilt first. The decision shocked both families. People kept asking me why, as if I should just look past the lies now that the truth was out. But I couldn't do it. A wedding is a celebration of a union, and I didn't want to unite with someone who was still carrying the baggage of his father's deception. I moved out of our shared apartment, taking only what was mine. It was the hardest thing I had ever done, but it was also the most honest. The families were furious, but for the first time in my life, I didn't care about their opinions. I was done trying to please them. I was choosing my own peace of mind over a life of constant uncertainty. It was a clean break, a way to reclaim my own story before it was written by the Whitmores for the rest of my life. Denise filed for divorce. Investors abandoned Preston. The second family became public knowledge. The man who once controlled everyone with money and fear lost both. He was forced to sell his assets to pay back the money he had stolen from his family's funds. He was left with nothing but his own bitter reputation. Seeing him lose his power was not the victory I expected, it was just a sad end to a long, unnecessary tragedy. He had spent his whole life trying to build a castle, only to realize he had been living in a dungeon. He ended up alone, with no one to trust him and nothing to hide behind. It was a stark reminder of what happens when greed becomes the guiding force of a person's existence. He thought money gave him control, but in the end, it was the truth that took everything from him. The town moved on, and the name Whitmore became a synonym for everything that goes wrong when you prioritize lies over people. A year later, Julian and I reunited after rebuilding our relationship honestly. We had spent time apart, working on our own issues. He had left his father's shadow completely, and I had regained my sense of self. We started over from scratch, with no secrets between us. We bought our first home using the same down payment Preston tried to take from me. At a small family gathering, Denise thanked me for exposing the truth. She was starting a new life, and she looked happier than I had ever seen her. Looking around the room, I realized something powerful. Preston thought money gave him control. He thought he could buy loyalty, silence, and his own version of reality. But he was wrong. In the end, it was the truth that took everything from him and gave me back my life. I had walked through the fire and come out on the other side, stronger and more determined than ever. I finally had the home I had always dreamed of, not just the building, but the honest life I had built inside it. I was finally at peace.